In fact, it's explicitly the same idea. If you read the things that the U.S. government actually writes about security, defense, so-called, and foreign policy strategy, the key idea is what they call primacy, that the U.S. should be the most powerful country in every region of the world, not only the most powerful of a world power, but the most powerful in every region. It needs to dominate. So in Europe, it needs to dominate Russia. That's what we've been talking about. In Asia, it needs to dominate China. Well, good luck on that. China's 1.4 billion people, a very sophisticated society. And strangely enough, China does not want to be dominated by the United States. China has enough memory of what foreign domination has meant. The British behaved abysmally in China, and the Chinese see the Americans, rightly so, as part of that Anglo-Saxon mentality. Remember, the British invaded China in 1839 to force China to accept opium. It's amazing. It's like as if the Colombian cocaine cartel invaded the United States to say you have to open your markets to Colombian cocaine.
That was a brilliant comparison. Brilliant comparison.
Oh, but this is exactly what Britain did, and China. They don't forget that. And now, what this has practically meant is that starting around 20 years ago, but really 10 years ago intensively, the United States strategists, if you could call them that, said China's rise is a threat to the United States because China's a big country. And so we have to take measures to stop China's rise. This is a kind of insanity, actually, because it's exactly what leads to wars. It's not the business of the United States to try to stop China's rise. But that's precisely what they are doing through unilateral tariff measures, blocking China's exports to the U.S., blocking American investments in China, taking measures like this stupid one last month where the U.S. Congress voted that TikTok has to either close or sell its operations to an American company. The U.S. went after Huawei, which is an excellent company, very innovative, very dynamic, and that's precisely why the U.S. attacked it, because it was too successful. The U.S. has stopped the sale of advanced semiconductors to China. The U.S. thinks this is normal, but the most dangerous point is the U.S. is doing in Taiwan what it did in Ukraine. For Ukraine, this is core Russian security. For the United States to say we're going to move our military into Ukraine is a direct and immediate threat to Russian security, a point that Putin has made for basically 20 years. In the case of China, Taiwan is the same security threat for China, especially after the period from 1839 to 1949, where imperial powers continued to invade China, threaten Chinese unity, carve off pieces of China as part of Japan's empire, and so on. China says, don't meddle in our unity. And that's why when countries establish diplomatic relations with China, they must adopt the one China policy, which says you are not going to try to separate pieces of China and divide our country again, as you did for a century, from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century. Taiwan looms very large in that story because Taiwan, actually both Taiwan and mainland China, the People's Republic of China, both have in their founding documents, the Republic of China in Taipei says there's one China. They disagree who should run it, but it's one China. But when the United States established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, it adopted the one China policy, that Taiwan is part of China. And yet it plays games, worse than games, extremely dangerous measures, saying, well, we're going to have a trade agreement with Taiwan. We're going to have arms agreements with Taiwan. We're going to support Taiwan's security, all while Taiwan is supposed to be part of China. And the United States ignores mainland China on this, ignores the People's Republic of China. Well, this is absolutely heading towards a war if the U.S. continues this. And I can't emphasize enough how stupid our Congress members are. They're people that are completely irresponsible. They don't know any history. They come from someplace in America, thousands of miles away from China. They've never been to China, but boy, they know everything about China. And they know that they're going to send weapons to Taiwan and they're going to protect Taiwan. And what they are doing is leading us closer and closer to war. And in the United States, in our press, this idea of a war with China is being normalized. It's mentioned almost every day in some news story. Oh, maybe there'll be a war with China, as if this isn't one of the greatest insanities one could imagine, because this would be potentially the end of the world. Yet the American mainstream media normalizes a war with Russia or normalizes a war with China as if this is absolutely normal and necessary, because after all, the United States needs to be number one in the world, and it's going to do what it needs to do to be number one. And in the meantime, this is what's leading to chaos in so many places.
It's horrible. I would say that there was nothing similar so far in the, let's say, in the history. You remember the Caribbean crisis. The leaders of both Washington and Moscow, at a certain moment, they understood that this is the red line. They should not cross at any, let's say, situation or circumstances. They were clever enough to stop from both sides, and this lecture, this lesson, was taken as something of a key importance for next many decades. Now, as if this is a taboo. It's unbelievable. I mean,
yeah, although I would say the following. You know, I've studied the Cuban Missile Crisis for a long time, tried to understand it. The truth is, we were extraordinarily lucky to get out of that alive. And it is, in the U.S. case, most of Kennedy's, John F. Kennedy's top advisors wanted to go to war. They wanted to have a military approach. It was almost only Kennedy and a couple of others, Adlai Stevenson and a couple of others, said, no, we need a diplomatic way out. On the Soviet side, there was actually more prudence. I don't think Gromyko wanted a war, and Nikita Khrushchev certainly didn't want a war. And in fact, when he put the missiles into Cuba in 1962, Gromyko said, what is this? Are we going to war? And Khrushchev said, no, we're not going to war, but we're just going to we're going to teach the Americans a little bit of their own medicine because they have missiles in Turkey. We're going to show them what it's like. But it was a big miscalculation because it almost led to the end of the world. But Khrushchev and Kennedy had the sense to pull back. But I'm not sure that our politicians today have that sense. Honest to God, I have to tell you, there are so many stupid and irresponsible American politicians. You can't even believe it. They don't care about war. They talk about war as normal. They want to send so many Ukrainians to their deaths because they even say the Ukraine war is wonderful. No Americans are dying, as if 500,000 Ukrainians aren't enough dead, and as if the risk of nuclear war isn't great enough. So I'm very worried in the United States system. So much power resides in the president. We've had a string of very mediocre to poor to dangerous presidents over the last 20 years. None of them has risen to the occasion. None. This is really very worrisome because our political system is broken. It's corrupted. It's not bringing the best people to the forefront by any means. Our two lead candidates right now, I regard Biden's presidency as a failure because he doesn't understand diplomacy. He's also 81 and he's too old for this job. And Trump is a very unstable person. These are our two lead candidates. This is something terrible for the world. And in the meantime, so many European leaders, I think, including in the Czech Republic, say, oh, yes, we follow the United States. That's our greatest ally. We have to do whatever the United States does. And don't people realize, don't do that. Be careful. Europe needs its own strategy, and it needs a strategy of peace, not a strategy of war.
Exactly. Tell me, as an American, after all these critical formulations, where is the break-even point, or how to call it, which would bring your political class, your political elite, to an understanding that the policies based on the obsessive primacies, let's say, targets and so on, are not realistic, and that a win-win strategy is the only, let's say, realistic option, which will be very good also for the United States. When and where this moment would come?
It's very important to know this and very hard to answer this. I can't imagine Biden or Trump leading that. And yet these are the two leading candidates right now. Neither of them has an understanding or realistic vision of the world. Neither of them has the idea that the world should be unified and in peace so that it can address problems together. None of them has the idea that the U.S. and China should cooperate with each other because it's the two most powerful countries, and the worst thing in the world would be a war. Even a Cold War, but a hot war between them is unimaginable. And so how this is going to happen and when is really a major puzzle. And what I believe is the case is that only the U.S., to get out of this peacefully, has to listen to public opinion. I work at the UN every day. At the UN, it's clear that the vast majority of countries in the world want peace and cooperation, and they don't want to choose sides between the U.S. and China or between the U.S. and Russia. They don't want to choose sides. They don't want to impose sanctions on Russia. They don't want to go to war against Russia because the U.S. tells them to do so. So I'm trying to explain to American public opinion and to American politicians that they're running against the whole spirit of the whole world. The U.S. is becoming increasingly isolated. One of the problems is, though, so much of Europe follows the U.S. blindly right now. And this is a puzzle for me because Europe's smarter than the U.S. It has more bad experience also in war. It should understand that this is a dead end. And Europe should understand, of course, that American hegemony or American primacy is not Europe's advantage. Europe is going to benefit from a multipolar world in which Europe is one of the poles of power, creativity, insight, and diplomacy, not as a vassal state of NATO. And yet the European leaders are very bad at this right now. You look at van der Leyen. She's, in my view, nothing but a U.S. Bureaucrat, basically.
Yes,
I find it very, very sad. And European foreign policy is basically do what the U.S. says. And if the U.S. blows up the Nord Stream pipeline, endangering the European economy, everybody pretends it didn't happen, or pretends that it was Russia that blew up its own pipeline or some other crazy idea like that.
Yeah. One more specific question, if you allow me. You have in the States the act called FARA or FARA, with Foreign Agents Regulation Act or something like this. There is a similar law in Russia, in Israel, and so on. And frankly speaking, in the countries like the Czech Republic, there's a growing interest in that maybe we should have something similar, because these as if NGOs, which are led by people from George Soros and so on, they are, let's say, playing their own games beyond any legal, let's say, democratic procedures and so on. And in other countries like, say, Georgia now, there is a big dispute whether the country can have a law which would, let's say, regulate somehow the activities of similar entities. What is your opinion upon this?
My opinion is very clear, which is the United States should stop meddling in the politics of other countries. Because what this is about is not simply NGOs. This is about politics. This is about U.S. money, official and quasi-private, because even these NGOs are aligned with the U.S. government. But this is about U.S. money turning the politics of other countries, even stoking unrest like the Maidan in Ukraine was a U.S.-funded operation. How do I know? Because they told me, because I saw it with my own eyes. U.S. Improper involvement in what was a coup. I saw it, and I hated it. And I have to say that this is what's happening in Georgia, too. The U.S. says, this is an infringement of Georgian rights. The infringement of Georgian rights is that the U.S. is meddling in Georgian politics. The U.S. should keep out of Georgian politics, and with all respect, Georgians should keep out of American politics.
Exactly.
So this is the basic point. And these laws are put in place to try to stop the meddling. We had senators go to the Maidan and chant to the people there, "We're with you, we're on your side," and so forth. Imagine if Chinese politicians had come to Donald Trump's rally on January 6th, 2021. Do you think the American people would say, "Oh, that's fine. Isn't that nice? Other countries are getting involved in our riots or our demonstrations or our protests or whatever"? No, the United States would not like it at all. It would drive our politics crazy. And indeed, even the false charges of Russian involvement in U.S. politics drove American politics crazy. But it's very important to understand, when you are an empire like the United States, double standards is the basic principle. The basic principle. You don't have to be consistent. You do what you tell others not to do. And the U.S. meddles everywhere in the world through the National Endowment of Democracy, the National Democratic Institute, USAID, NGOs. I know it. I've seen it with my own eyes. It's not good. It's not healthy. This is what's going on right now.
Last question. I'm too much consuming of your time. There is a category of enemy images. We understand, most of us, what does it mean. And this is a even ever bigger instrument in the dirty games, which are pushing the world to very critical, if not dangerous, let's say, situations. What can we, Jeff, do, let's say, against these enemy images? And could we somehow cooperate across the Atlantic in these efforts?
We need to cooperate globally because we need to bring in Chinese colleagues, Russian colleagues, African colleagues, Latin American colleagues. We hear so much falsity. I almost never hear the truth from the U.S. government anymore. I know the situation with my own eyes all over the world because that's my work. My work is to be abroad. My work is to be engaged in discussions with governments all over the world. That's what it means to work with the United Nations and on international objectives. And so I hear directly many things, and I can see with my own eyes and hear with my own ears that the U.S. is lying so much of the time. Now, the mainstream media generally repeats these lies. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the main cable networks. This is a big problem because the public hears a false view of things. And in Europe, it's been the same. Exactly. Ever since the Ukraine war broke out, if you say anything that says, well, there's a background to it, there's a history to it, there should have been peace, this has to do with NATO, immediately you're branded, you're a Putin apologist, you're a fool, you get on Ukraine's hate list, many things, all to shut down debate. Same thing is happening with respect to Israel right now. Israel is committing terrible war crimes, I believe genocide. But if you say so, oh no, you're violating every standard, every norm. So truth is really at a premium right now, and that's why what you're doing and alternative outlets are so important because. And it's probably the big benefit of the digital age in this regard. There are many downsides, but at least we have the chance to hear a wider range. You have to search for it. It's not going to come in the mainstream media. And interestingly, we had Tucker Carlson in the United States interview President Putin, and he was attacked by all the mainstream. How dare you do that? And yet hundreds of millions of people watch that, apparently. And that is amazing because people want to hear themselves. They don't want to hear it through these government propaganda outlets, basically. So this is what we really need to do. It's hard. And the dangers are very high right now because we're really in the midst of a very, very serious crisis, which, as I've explained, I believe the United States has done the most to instigate, actually. And we need diplomacy just to stay alive. And if we can stay alive and stop the worst, then we can work on getting the truth out, too.